Open your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 27. Find your way to verse 39. Acts 27:39 will begin our time this morning there. We've been looking at the shipwreck, the storm, the trip to Rome for the Apostle Paul and his companions Luke and Aristarchus, some of the navigational details and the events of their time at sea. And we've seen we've called them good providences through the process. And we know that God is good. We know that God is good all the time. Even in the midst of a shipwreck, He is good. And we'll see that as we dive into our passage a little bit more closely together this morning. We've been looking at a map that I think has been helping us along the way, just so we know where we are geographically and chronologically. We have begun this journey over there at the bottom right portion of the map in Judea. Paul had been through several trials where he was declared innocent, but because of the lack of righteousness among the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman political leaders, he was forced to appeal to Caesar. And so he was sent to see Caesar in Rome. And you can see that this whole event here in Acts chapter 27 is to get the apostle from Judea over to Rome. They began their journey there in Caesarea. They stopped off in Sidon, and there Paul was able to visit some fellow believers there who encouraged him. They then began to sail toward Rome, but because the winds were contrary, they were blowing out of the northwest, which would be the upper left-hand corner of the map, toward them, directly opposite of what they would hope the wind would be doing. They had to sail under the protection of the island of Cyprus, and then they got around the tip of Cyprus there, and they sailed under the protection of the regions known as Pamphylia and Lycia. You can see there that they hugged the coast there of Asia Minor as we know it, and then they went south because they could no longer sail directly across to Macedonia. They had to go under the shelter of the island of Crete. And so they made it there just south of Crete, and they were along the shoreline there. They made it to a place called Fair Havens, and they decided that they needed to spend the winter. It had taken too long for them to get from Caesarea to where they were then at Crete, and they knew they couldn't get to Rome all at once. So they decided to spend the winter there at Crete, but Fair Havens wasn't the ideal spot, so they wanted to go a little bit further northwest, and they set a course for the place called Phoenix. Now, the wind was behind them at first, coming from the south, a gentle breeze, as Luke describes it, and everything was going well, but soon there came a wind out of the northeast, the upper right-hand corner of the map, and it was a strong wind. It just wasn't a breeze, it was a storm. And it blew them off course, and you can see the route now heading toward the north coast of Africa. They were blown in that direction, but they were afraid of getting caught up in the shallow areas of the ocean there in the southern Mediterranean, and so they tried with all their might to stay north of North Africa and stay away from those shallow areas to prevent shipwreck. They were in this stormy weather day after day after day for a couple of weeks. The ship was tossed here and there. There was rain, there was wind. They despaired of life. It was so serious. We left them last Sunday morning in the dark. They can hear some waves in the distance, but they don't really know where they are. They're sure they're getting close to land, but there they were, sitting on the ship. The ship itself is in tatters. They have thrown all the cargo overboard. They're wet, they're cold, they're tired. 276 souls waiting for what would happen next. Let's read together our passage, beginning again in Acts 27, verse 39. Luke writes for us, "When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach. and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly this man is a murderer. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him, and he healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. Today we cover the shipwreck at Malta. And you'll see there at the end of chapter 27, we see their arrival at Malta. And then the first part of chapter 28, we see their stay at Malta. And so as we look at their arrival, and that's a nice way of saying they shipwrecked near the island, they arrive and there's a plan for them. They have been able to look around and see what their situation is, and so they make a plan. Luke writes, when day came. Okay, the day dawns, and for the first time in weeks, they see land. You can imagine the thrill in all these people's minds that there's land and we can see it. Luke says they could not recognize the land. He doesn't include himself in the group who's trying to identify what they're looking at. Luke is not an expert sailor, but he says that the sailors couldn't even recognize what they see. But they tried, and they did see something that was promising to them. The end of verse 39. But they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. So they took counsel together. They talked about their situation, and from what they see, this is the best solution. They want to drive the ship onto the beach. Now, 3 items of preparation are given to us. Look at verse 40. First, Luke says, casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea. You remember back in verse 29, the night before, just a few hours before, it was dark and they were afraid that they were going to run aground somewhere on some rocks. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear the fact that they were near a coast. And so they threw anchors out over the stern or the back of the ship, and they just wanted daybreak to come. So here, the first item of preparation is to cut loose those anchors. They removed the ropes, and they just left them there. You can see their attitude about the ship. The ship itself and its equipment, they're just given up. It had experienced too much damage during the storm. And so they just wanted to get themselves to land. The second detail Luke gives is the middle of verse 40. It says, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. Now, rudders on a ship, they're the steering mechanism of the ship. There would be a tiller, a long horizontal stick, or a wheel connected to a flat wooden blade below or in the back of the ship that stood vertically in the water. And when you turned the wheel or moved the rudder, that blade would move back and forth. Large ships had two rudders. Think of them like broad oars or paddles down in the water, and they were joined together by a pole, and they were managed by whoever was the man at the helm. In a storm, the steering mechanisms of the ship were tied up tightly with ropes so that they wouldn't break in the rough seas. Also, when we're told that they threw the anchors over the back of the ship, back in verse 29, they would tie up the steering apparatus to keep the anchor chains or the ropes from tangling up there. And so they had these all bound tightly, but they needed to release them in order to move the ship. So after cutting the anchors loose, they cut the rudders loose. They cut the steering mechanism loose so it could be useful. And then the end of verse 40, we have the third action item. Hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach. The foresail would be the one closest to the front of the ship. It could be that this was the only sail they had. During the storm, we read about them throwing all their equipment overboard. We don't know all the details of the equipment, but this is all they had, likely, and this is all they needed. They could see where they were going. What was their plan? They simply wanted to sail straight toward the beach that they saw. They wanted to get the ship moving as fast as possible, get as close as possible to the shore. Ideally, there would be a sandy bottom that they could literally sail the ship up the beach and get it stuck there so they could jump out and wade through the water safely. So that was their plan. It's a good plan. For what they can see, it's a reasonable plan. But it wasn't the plan. You see, God has the plan. Proverbs 16:9, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And the Lord's plan is always not just good, but it's better. And it's not even just better, it's the best. God's plan is always the best plan. And so there are details here that these people can't see, but God knows what's going on, and so he is going to work the details out such that it's going to accomplish more than what they had planned themselves. The test that they're undergoing is going to last a little bit longer. It's going to end differently than they had thought. The men, they couldn't see below the surface of the water. So we read in verse 41, as we get into the adjustment now, but striking a reef where two seas met. A reef is unseen below the surface of the water, coral or rocks, even sandbars. And as the ship passes over, it's too shallow for the ship to go over it smoothly, and it sticks. If there are rocks there, it'll literally tear the bottom of the ship that was already weakened because of the storm. And so Luke says they ran the vessel aground. The ship is now stuck. Luke gives more details. The end of verse 41, he says, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. This is the front of the ship. We might call it the bow of the ship. And they couldn't back the ship up to get out of this reef because of the force of the current against them from behind toward the shore. They couldn't steer the ship any longer. There was no maneuverability. It was stuck fast in the reef. Luke goes on at the end of verse 41 and says, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The onslaught of the pounding waves as the ship was stuck there, it wasn't going to remain there long. The waves began to tear apart the back of the ship. Now, they can see the land, and if you can swim, you're thinking, well, we'll work this out. But if you can't, like most people on board, they're afraid for their lives. Something had to be done. The ship couldn't take further punishment. They needed to move. Well, the soldiers had an idea. Look at verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. You might think, well, what does that have to do with the shipwreck? I mean, it's being broken apart and they need to get to the shore. Well, the soldiers, their worldview was all about their duty. And their sole duty on this trip from Judea to Rome was to deliver these prisoners safely to Caesar. These prisoners must be brought back to Rome at all costs. If the prisoner wasn't brought alive, the next best option would be to kill the prisoner and then tell the authorities back at Rome that he was dead. The point is, escape was not an option. These soldiers in no way were going to let any of these men escape. The reason for this, they're just thinking in a self-preservation mindset. They would be killed themselves if the prisoners escaped. So this would be a normal action in this type of situation. We've seen soldiers pay for prisoners who were escaped with their lives before in the book of Acts. Think back to Acts chapter 12. After Peter's led out of prison by the angel, it says that the next day Herod searches for Peter and doesn't find him. So what does he do? He examines the guards in the prison and orders that they be led away to execution. Later on in the city of Philippi, Acts chapter 16, you remember there's a great earthquake that comes and all the jail doors are broken open. And the jailer wakes up, sees the prison doors open, and what does he do? He draws his sword, and he's about to kill himself. Better that than have himself be killed by the authorities. So the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. But they had forgotten God's promise. You see, God had told Paul that not only would he make it to Rome, but that everybody on board the ship would remain alive through the storm and through the shipwreck. So the centurion intervenes. Look at verse 43. Let's run to verse 43, beginning with verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention. Remember the centurion's kindness already shown from the very beginning of the journey back at Sidon. In verse 3, he allows the Apostle Paul and Luke to go and visit fellow believers there on shore. This centurion is motivated by Paul, or motivated to get Paul safely to Rome. But why? What is it about the Apostle Paul that causes this centurion to intervene and save not only his life, but all the rest of the prisoners' lives? It could be that he sees the value in the person of Paul. He's spent a couple of weeks with him now. He might understand that he's a virtuous man, that he's really innocent of any kind of crime. Undoubtedly, they've had time to talk. He's seen his leadership abilities in the midst of the storm, and in fact, he's likely grateful to him that they're still alive. It could be that he sees, and he might not label it this way, but he sees the goodness of God in the Apostle Paul, and he wants to be near that. He knows there's something different about this man, so he wants to keep him safe so that maybe, as we would call in a common grace sort of way, he can have a blessed life as well. We don't know where he's at spiritually speaking, but it's at least that. So his desire, as we said, to keep the Apostle Paul alive saved the rest of the prisoners also. God's at work here. God is working through these people to accomplish his purposes. Now, we understand, if we take a step back from the passage, that God had already said twice in two different visions to the apostle that he will arrive safely to Rome. So, in the spiritual realm, there's never any danger of Paul losing his life here, even in light of the soldiers' plans. God chooses to use the centurion to accomplish his purposes, and that's the fulfillment of his promise in the centurion, as Luke says, who kept the soldiers from their intention. It seems he had to get a bit firm with them, that there are more soldiers than there are centurions. There's only one centurion, and he has to stand between them and the prisoners and keep them from carrying out the desires. So somehow he convinces them that it won't be too difficult to round up the prisoners once everybody has reached the shore. Now, two modes to get to shore. First, at the end of verse 43, we see the centurion say, those who could swim, they should jump overboard and get to land. That's easy. If you're able to swim, go ahead and jump over and swim. Second, that would be floating. Verse 44, look what he says. And the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. You see, the breaking up of the ship actually was a mercy for those who could not swim. The fact that there would now be pieces of lumber, different elements of wood and furniture, whatever it was that could float, people could grab onto that and kick their legs and get in to shore. So this occurs, and at the end of verse 44, the end of chapter 27, we see that Luke summarizes it with these words, and so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. Imagine the picture, 276 men strewn out upon the beach. No doubt, they were overjoyed to be on solid ground. I mean, there's a desire to be on solid ground even if you have a 2-week journey that goes smoothly, if you're on the ocean. If you've experienced what they've experienced, you're excited just to be able to lay on something that's not moving. So God's promise that everybody on ship would live has occurred. You see God's goodness at work here. He has cared for them. Sometimes when God cares for you, the road is bumpy. God's care for you doesn't mean that there's only comfort along the way. God's care for you includes growth for you. And honestly, we only grow when we're tested and stretched and when the road is bumpy. I don't know anybody who's ever grown when life is smooth. Jesus, of course, needed nothing like this because he was already perfect and lived a perfect life. But for the rest of humanity, for all of humanity, we all need those times of stretching. And so God's goodness grows us and sometimes is difficult. So God saves Paul and all those with him. We see the arrival at Malta, now the stay at Malta. And first there's a welcome that goes on. They're all laying there on the beach. The welcome begins in verse 1 of chapter 28. When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. Now we have a second map that's a close-in picture of the journey. And you see Malta there. It's a small island in relationship to the rest of the land around. 18 miles long by about 8 miles wide. 60 miles south of Sicily. 180 miles northeast of Africa. In the 2 weeks that the ship had spent at sea between Crete and here, they had traveled some 600 miles. The island was well known. The main harbor was some distance away, however. That's why when they looked at the island, they couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't the main harbor they were seeing. In fact, according to tradition, what they were looking at is a landing spot that we call today St. Paul's Bay. You can go to Malta today and look at that spot. Verse 2, Luke says, the natives showed us extraordinary kindness. Let's stop there for a moment. The word natives there is the Greek word barbaros, from which we get the word barbarian. It's a word that in the Greek is using onomatopoeia, the idea that the sound of the word is the meaning of the word. So to the Greek ear, when they heard a foreign language, it sounded to them like bar, 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 bar. And so they said barbaros, these people. It doesn't so much have to do with our word barbarian in terms of there's a lack of civilization for these people. It's more so that the Greek mind looked at a person that they would label as barbaros, anybody who didn't know Greek anybody who was unfamiliar with Greek culture, any non-Greek person. It wasn't so much that they were uncultured, it was that they weren't Greek cultured. And so they looked down their noses at all non-Greek people. More neutrally, we might just say they were foreigners from the perspective of those on the ship. Specifically, these people are native Maltese people from the island of Malta. And history tells us that Malta was inhabited by people from Phoenicia or Carthage some 1,000 years before Christ. Their native tongue is a combination, really a North African dialect that's even existent today, so that the Maltese language is a unique blend of an Arabic dialect mixed with Italian. Malta had been a Roman colony since 200 BC. It seems that there were some Roman citizens and retired soldiers who lived on the island, but the focus here is on the natives of the island. Again, Luke says the natives showed us extraordinary kindness. Here we have the word, again, philanthropia. Philanthropy, love of mankind. Same words used back in verse 3 of chapter 27 to describe Julius, the centurion's consideration toward the Apostle Paul. Luke labels this philanthropy, this kindness, as extraordinary, uncommon, special. In general, Romans or Greeks didn't expect this kind of treatment from foreigners. What we have here, as we see how the Maltese natives are treating these shipwrecked men, is we have God's common grace at work. You know that God is one who shows philanthropy in this sense. You know, the same word is used over in Titus chapter 3 and verse 4. It says, when the kindness of God our Savior and his, here it is, love for mankind appeared. That's the word. And so when mankind shows any kind of philanthropy, it's just a small taste of what God is and who he is and his goodness. Luke goes on in verse 2 and describes this extraordinary kindness and says this, for because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. Just imagine these men. I mean, these poor men, they're making their way up the beach, and all of a sudden it starts raining on them. They're already cold. They're already wet. And as the rain and the cold come, the natives receive all of them. They welcome them. This would undoubtedly include food, a shelter, a way and a place to dry off. Quite an undertaking to show hospitality to 276 men. But they do so. Now, some think this is motivated because they're fearful of the Roman soldiers. But Luke is the one who's there. He's the one who's giving a first-person account of what's going on. He's the one who looks at what happens and says, no, this is extraordinary kindness. This is something done out of the graciousness of their hearts. This is motivated by compassion. God's goodness at work here through the Maltese people. So that's the welcome. Look now at the supernatural protection. Again, just a little event that on its own, it only covers 3 or 4 verses, and you think, why is this included? But it just fits the realness of the story. Verse 3, but when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and had laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. The first noteworthy element of this verse is that doing God's work doesn't preclude a person from doing mundane chores. Here you have the great apostle Paul, the most important Christian on the planet, and he's going and gathering sticks for the fire. He's involved in just functioning there among the people. And we don't want to communicate anything more than what is said here regarding Paul's eyesight or what happened, how did he confuse a snake with a stick or a stick with a snake. Snakes can look like sticks, especially when it's cold, especially when it's raining. Snakes are reptiles, and they are stiff and they are lethargic. They don't move. So he collects this bundle of sticks with a snake included. He comes nearer the fire. As the snake is warmed by the fire, it wakes up. Luke says that this viper comes out because of the heat and fastens itself on Paul's hand. We're not sure what kind of snake this was, but we do know, because of the Maltese natives' reaction, that this is a poisonous snake, one with deadly venom. And it didn't just bite him and then slither away. It fastens onto his hand. It's struck and it's hanging there. And all of a sudden, the Apostle Paul is in mortal danger again. His poor guardian angels are working overtime. Verse 4. Look what happens here. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, so you can just picture that, the snake is dangling from the apostle's hand. They began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." So they're confident in this. Why? Well, because in the culture there, among their own island and among the Greek culture as a whole, many stories contained the progress of a guilty man escaping one form of death only to face another form of death. Sometimes this does happen. In fact, we can read in the Old Testament, Amos chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. Listen to what the prophet writes. "Alas, you who are longing for the day of the Lord, for what purpose will the day of the Lord be to you? It will be darkness and not light, as when a man flees from a lion and a bear meets him, or goes home, leans his hand against the wall, and a snake bites him." So they're seeing the same type of event happen in the Apostle Paul's life. He's been saved from the sea, but now justice is not going to let him live. So justice has allowed him to be bitten by this venomous snake. A sea voyage was viewed by the Hellenistic culture and written about in Hellenistic literature as a prime opportunity for the gods to bring judgment upon the guilty. You can think even back to Old Testament days. This is during the prophet Jonah's life. You remember, the ship is caught in a storm. And what are the sailors trying to do? They're trying to find out whose God is angry that's brought about this storm. Because if we can deal with the person whose God is angry, remove him, then the storm will go away. So this is the mindset that they're seeing the events here. And their assuredness, their confidence, is something that fits into the world's perspective on right and wrong and punishment. The world says if someone does wrong, they will suffer harm during life. If someone does right, they will be blessed during life. And in a proverbial sense, that's true, but we can't always equate the events of life with right or wrong done prior. The Bible is full of examples of this. Job's counselors were trying to convince Job of this principle, trying to tell him he had done something wrong to bring about this suffering. In the New Testament, the Pharisees taught this principle, and this thinking affected even the disciples' understanding. They asked Jesus the question, who sinned, this man or his parents, because he was blind? There had to be some sort of correlation between his old life and his suffering presently. And then we can look at the non-corresponding examples that the Bible gives us to remind us that the fact that this is not always true. In fact, Asaph in Psalm 73 describes how the wicked are prospering. and he's wrestling with that doesn't seem right. And then, of course, we have the ultimate example, Jesus, suffering after a perfect life, completely righteous. So their mindset is simply a subset of the world's perspective. You do wrong, you'll suffer. If something's happening negative to you, it's because of something you've done. And so they see the snake, they make the judgment. But then in verse 5, however, he, the Apostle Paul, shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. You know something? The one person who's not afraid of what's going on right now is Paul. Because he's already been promised that he is going to Rome. In fact, he could look at himself here on the island of Malta as invincible. Anything dangerous need to be done? I'll do it, he'll say, because God has promised me twice that I'm going to be in Rome. Verse 6, but they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. This just reminds us again of the fact that they knew what kind of snake that was. They knew what they saw. They knew that all the people who had been bitten in this way by that snake, they had all died and suffered greatly. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. Paul's still walking around. There's not even any swelling going on. And we see God's goodness at work here. How? Think of how many ways the Apostle Paul could have been bitten by a snake. And the way God has it occur is that Paul's able to hold up his hand and show everybody that he has a snake bite. It's not done in a corner. It's not done somewhere where nobody can see it, where he has to tell them and convince them. But the way it all works out is he is standing there with the snake hanging on his hand, proof for all the people there, all the Maltese people, to see a miracle that's about to occur. Now, over in Mark chapter 16 and verse 18, that's part of that end of the Gospel of Mark, a difficult section. It says, they will pick up serpents, talking about believers. Regardless of how we look at the end of the Gospel of Mark, this idea that believers could pick up serpents is undoubtedly connected to the event here we read about in Acts chapter 28. So as the Maltese people see this, they change their minds and begin to say that he is a god. Obviously, their first conclusion had been wrong. And so the pendulum swings from one error over into an equal and opposite error. Human reasoning is so fickle, isn't it? No, he's not a murderer. He's certainly a god. That's what he must be. Paul has experienced with this before as well. You remember he had 2 other shipwrecks, and he just experienced a third. There was another time where he was called the god back on the first missionary journey in Lystra. And even then, those people, they showed their fickleness because after they tried to worship him, then they tried to stone him soon afterward. So we can be confident that Paul handled this situation in the same way as he had done in Lystra. Luke doesn't give any more details. He moves on now from this supernatural protection to supernatural healing in verse 7. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. This man is likely a wealthy man, a perhaps governor of some sort of the island, and he welcomes them, and they stay with him for 3 days. Again, hospitality on display. He hosts some 300 people on his land. We see God's goodness shown through this man to others who were in need. And then in verse 8, we see the opportunity for the healing to occur. And it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. Successive attacks. You can think of malaria-like symptoms. And then Luke says, Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. There's the supernatural healing. How good God is to bring Paul all along that journeys from Judea to the island of Malta so that this man could be healed. Think of all the difficulty that God worked out for this. Now, verse 9, the miracle spreads. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. It sounds like Jesus' ministry, doesn't it? There's a healing and somebody hears about it, they spread the news, and all of a sudden there are crowds of people. Similar to Jesus' ministry, but in contrast to Jesus' ministry, Jesus doesn't have to pray to somebody who's more powerful than him to heal a person. He can just rebuke the illness in his own power. And notably, remember who's writing this? Dr. Luke. He had helped Paul with his own illness. Both Paul and Luke are here together, and the people are all coming to Paul to get cured. And he's healing them by laying his hands on them. You wonder what Luke is thinking. All his medical training. He must be amazed at what's going on here. I mean, having a doctor there while Paul's healing all these people, it's kind of like driving a food truck to the place where Jesus is feeding the 5,000. Like, well, thanks for coming, but we don't really need your services now. You would imagine Luke is obviously still helpful. Maybe some follow-up visits somehow. Next time you get sick and we're not here, here's what you can do to prevent or help yourself to recover from your illness. But supernatural goodness is going on here through the Apostle Paul as God is working to heal these people. And undoubtedly, even though Luke doesn't give detail, you know that there is connection of spiritual truth being given to not just the people on the ship during the storm and now that they've been brought safely to land, but to all these people who are experiencing this time with the Apostle Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. We come finally to the farewell in verse 10. Luke writes, they also honored us with many marks of respect. Many honors. The word is even used to describe honorariums. We're not sure why Luke used this specific word here, but he's communicating that the people continue to show blessing to those from the ship. We read at the very end of verse 10 now, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. A lot of detail missing now. You think, well, setting sail on what? What ship? Well, this is not a deserted island. In total, they spend about 3 months here. We'll see this as we move forward. And Malta was on the shipping route from Alexandria to Rome, and so many ships came through the area. They just weren't at the main harbor, so likely they hiked over to the main harbor, found a ship, and were able to move forward once the winds became more favorable. Luke says, finally, they supplied us with all that we needed in gratitude for everything that God had done through Paul. Another example of God's good providence. We think of everything that's happened here from the beginning of chapter 27, and just mark in your mind all the good providences that God has allowed to happen. Back in verse 2, we see that Luke and Aristarchus are allowed to go with Paul on his journey to Rome. And then in verse 3, again, Julius allows Paul and Luke and Aristarchus to go and receive care and kindness from friends in Sidon. We move down to verse 23, and we see God's goodness in bringing a vision to the Apostle Paul as an encouragement. In verse 31, we have Paul interacting and the centurion interacting with the soldiers who are trying to steal the boat to get off, and God keeps it from happening through the people and their decisions. In verse 35, you have them sharing kind of a last meal on the ship as they take bread and give thanks to God. And then we look to verse 42, and we see the soldiers' plan to kill everybody, or kill all the prisoners. But then God intervenes through the centurion to keep them safe. In verse 44, we spoke about the ship breaking up, but then there being pieces of the ship to float on for those who couldn't swim. We moved to chapter 28, the natives showing kindness in verse 2. In verse 5, we see the snake not causing any suffering to the Apostle Paul. Verse 7, kindness and goodness shown through the leading man of the island. Verse 8, a man being healed of sickness. Verse 9, all the people being healed of different diseases. And finally, verse 10, the blessing that the natives give to Paul and Luke, Aristarchus, as they depart from them. And we count all those on purpose. We take the time to do that because as you move through your own events of life, you can do the same thing. You can see God's goodness through the trial. It just takes work to do it. You see, because by default, we don't look at God's goodness. We look at the difficulties. But He's always there. He's always supporting. He's always providing. He's always encouraging. If your hope is misdirected, if your hope is on your own comfort, you're not going to see any of that. You're going to be focused on what is temporary. Think, for example, just of one event in this whole storm at sea and then the shipwreck. Think of Paul being bitten by a snake. Think if his hope was not on God, how he might have responded. He could have reasonably said, "Haven't I suffered enough? And now a snake bite? I was trying to help by gathering wood for the fire, and God allows this to happen?" But rather than complain, he trusts that God is at work. And we can read just through the next couple of verses and see that, wow, by God having the snake bite Paul in this way at this time, all the Maltese people were impressed by what's going on here. We trust that the events we read about here are foundations for spiritual blessing. Again, we have the 276 souls on board. We have 3 months there in Malta. You see, God has come near to all these people. And not only is He concerned about their life on earth, He's concerned about saving them from sin and death. I think we can be confident that we will meet people who are on this ship in heaven. I think we can be confident that we can meet people from the island of Malta during this event in heaven, because we are confident God's at work through His children as they just live through life. So Luke has given us in our passage the arrival at Malta, a plan, and then an adjustment. Luke has given us a description of their stay at Malta, describing their welcome, describing a supernatural protection and supernatural healing, and then their farewell. And we see threaded through these events, God's goodness. We see it in the big picture. We know that Paul eventually does get to Rome, and we see it even in the most intricate details. And we know God never changes. He's always good. He's always good to you, and that should be an encouragement to us. God's plans are always the best. In fact, we could always call the goodness of God as the best. But the word bestness is not a word. But that's what we can think of about God's goodness. Because any characteristic or attribute that you connect with God, it's always going to be the height of that attribute. So anything that God does is good. It's the best good that's being done always, at all times. He's in control of all the details, and He's bringing about the best plan, not only in the big picture, but in the details of your own life. Well, Lord willing, we will next week conclude our journey to Rome and conclude our journey through the book of Acts. For now, let's pray together.